We are now 1 month away from the political intellectual event of the year. Unregistered Weekend in Chicago, featuring Curtis Yarvin, Ben Burgess, Batya Ungar Sargon, and me. 3 days of free speech, free thought, and saying what you're not supposed to say. We now have 2 tiers of tickets so everyone can afford to come. Go to unregisteredacademy.com to get your tickets now. I hope to see you there. This is the Unregistered podcast, and I'm Thaddeus Russell. This is a show about ideas, people, and behaviors that are considered inappropriate, out of bounds, or beyond the pale. The things you're not supposed to talk about if you're a school teacher, a college professor, a businessman, a politician, a parent, a neighbor, or even a podcast host. These are the things you're not supposed to say or even think if you're a good liberal, a good conservative, or a good citizen. Each week, I'll interview a person who has something bad to say. They might be a journalist or a professor. They might be a porn star or a drug dealer. They might just be an ordinary person with an ordinary job who doesn't care about the rules of polite society. I'm not interested in breaking the rules just to be a troublemaker. I'm interested in people who break the rules of conventional thought and to expand the scope of what is possible to say in our society. I'm interested in people who make me think. There is a perspective on the war in Ukraine that we never see in the American media. I think that if we did, the war would soon be over. This is my interview with Mark Sleboda. I am joined by Mark Sleboda from Moscow, not Idaho. This would be Russia. Mark is American-born, but has lived in Russia for the better part of the last 20 years, I believe.
Yes.
And is an academic, has taught at Moscow State University, has taught with Alexander Dugin, who was on this show in January, is friends with Alexander and with Alexander's daughter, Daria, who was assassinated recently. And Mark is a critic of Western intervention in Russian affairs and in Ukraine and in general. And because of that is called a Putin puppet, as am I, and as is anyone in this country who, I think this is right, voices any criticism whatsoever of American involvement in the war. So I guess I want to start off by kind of asking you your general position, what your general position is and orientation is toward the war, toward Western foreign policy, and toward Putin. Now, for those who are just listening, you kind of announced it already by wearing a Z pin on your lapel right up front there, which I appreciate very much. So why don't you tell us, like, what are your politics vis-a-vis Vladimir Putin and Russia and the Ukraine war?
Okay. Well, first of all, let me start off with full disclosure.
Okay.
So, my wife is Crimean.
Right.
She's from Simferopol, and we have family. My mother-in-law still lives in Simferopol, and we have family all over East Ukraine, Donbass, Kharkov, Odessa. So when it comes to the conflict in Ukraine, and I mean both the ongoing civil conflict that started in 2014 when the government there was overthrown by the openly US-backed putsch, and since the Russian intervention in that conflict in 2014, I am not objective in the sense that I am not partisan, right? And I make no qualms about that, but I also think it gives me an interesting perspective that is just completely silenced, denied all agency in the Western mainstream media narratives. That is the perspective of the people of East Ukraine, who have seen their political parties lustrated, banned, pogromed, who have been silenced and repressed since 2014, who have been branded and dismissed as some non-human entities, as pro-Russian separatists and the like, basically denied all human agency and any concern for their human rights and their human values, because geopolitics. I mean, that's ultimately the goal. The people of East Ukraine that do not support what happened in Ukraine in 2014 and since are, geopolitically inconvenient to the United States and the West. So I'm certainly not objective when it comes to that, but at least I like to think that my particularly my military analysis is fairly objective, and I'm a frequent critic of the Kremlin and the Russian Ministry of Defense when it comes to their non-action or relative non-action in East Ukraine since 2014 until earlier this year, and their continuing mistakes as I see them in their continuation of their intervention, as they call it, their special military operation now. So, full disclosure. And also, I took Russian citizenship. I emigrated to Russia. I am a Russian citizen. Technically, I am a dual citizen because I haven't paid the thousands of dollars that's necessary to give up my American citizenship, if for no other reason than that. But I don't consider myself to be American anymore. I've divorced myself from that, from the insane political theater masquerading as the one true democracy of the world there. And I don't vote in U.S. elections, and the like. So again, full disclosure on that. I'm a Russian. My wife is Crimean. She considers herself Russian. Actually, let me tell you a little anecdote there. The first time I met my wife was around 2000, I guess, in a nightclub in Boston, and a goth fetish nightclub, actually. And I met her and started talking to her, and I heard her accent. She speaks fluent American English, but she still has a slight accent. And I said, "Oh, you're from somewhere in Eastern Europe," and she says, "Yes, I'm from the Crimea." And I said, "Oh, you're Ukrainian," and she slapped me across the face. And that was my introduction to ethnic politics and national identity conception in Ukraine. And it's been a long learning lesson ever since. And I often, to be honest, I feel myself more of a, shall we say, Crimean and East Ukrainian in terms of, Donbass and the stuff, often more than I consider myself pro-Russian.
Okay. So you are not objective. In other words, you're not like the Western media.
Yeah. I mean, they're totally objective. I mean,
they're just calling it like they see it.
Yeah, obviously.
They're not partisans of either side. That's pretty clear.
Yes, I just, before we came on, I had a wonderful little Twitter spat with an American photojournalist in Ukraine, currently in Bakhmut, and I hope he stays there till the end.
Yes.
Who was apologizing for Bandera, of course, and the whole politics of that there. And when I mentioned that my wife is from Crimea and we have family all over East Ukraine, he replied, "She's not from Crimea. She's either from Ukraine or a traitor, just like you." And I'm like, okay, I take it back. You are not a sociopathic Banderite fascist apologist. You're a raving Banderite fascist yourself. To dismiss an entire people as traitors, and you're a journalist, a photojournalist, whatever. Yeah, okay. So that's goes right to the heart of the objectivity. There hasn't been any I'm not sure there has ever been objectivity in media, to be perfectly honest, on anywhere, anytime. But how little there has been painfully obvious since 2014. So,
my goodness. Well, that is definitely full disclosure, and I very much appreciate that. So, just to be honest here, if you Google your name, you know what you
Oh
see.
yeah, yeah,
You
yeah,
see Putin puppet, Putin's
yeah.
henchman, Putin's this or that. Putin. Now you've been critical of Putin though.
Oh
Is this
yeah.
right?
I mean, I've been critical of Putin in the Russian sense, in that I vote for him as president, as the
Okay.
lesser of any other evils, right?
Hmm.
I don't consider myself a united Russia supporter. My wife is actually a card-carrying member and election supervisor for KPRF, the Communist Party of the Russian Federation.
Hmm.
She is, in opposition to the Putin administration. Technically, but that being said, she still votes for Putin for president because, while she votes for the communists for Duma positions and local positions and the like, because foreign policy command, and she, largely being from Crimea, of course, completely agrees, or generally, no, she does not completely agree. Like me, she generally agrees with the course of Putin's foreign policy in Ukraine and the former Ukraine and elsewhere. But that's not to say that we don't have lots of, objections to him, both to the course, of those, general results and, certain domestic disagreements that do not come from a Western liberal perspective in any sense of form, but are frequently the type of criticisms that many people in Russia have with the leader. That you don't actually agree with anything all your political leaders do, that you're allowed to disagree with them. And I know that is not the conception in the West of politics in Russia, but it's as true as it is anywhere. We support one political leader on a general platform and perspective, but feel free to disagree with them on specific issues, and that's certainly the case here. And I have been very critical. I was very critical of the Putin administration in 2014, 2015 for not intervening as soon as even before the government was overthrown there in Ukraine and in Kiev, and considering the open Western involvement with Victoria Nuland and handing out cookies on the Maidan, and the flood of Western politicians jetting in and just chilling on the Maidan stage, calling for revolution in a foreign country. I mean, it was. Stratfor called it the most obvious coup in history. Who am I to disagree with Stratfor? So yeah, I disagreed for the non-intervention there. I disagreed, for the attempt, what I believe naive attempt of the Minsk Accords to seek political reconciliation, not just between the two, between inside Ukraine, but that effectively it would have been political reconciliation between Russia and the West as well. I thought that was naive, and sure enough, Angela Merkel and Petro Poroshenko have both informed us that they never intended to fulfill the terms, that it was always just biding time while they built up a powerful Kiev regime military force. So, but yeah, I have frequent criticisms domestically, internationally, but they are generally not the criticisms that you will hear in the Western liberal media.
Mm-hmm. So you've been publicly critical of Vladimir Putin while living in Russia, and you have not been
I've been publicly critical of Vladimir Putin on Russian state media and TV almost every day for the last several years, at least several times a week for the last several years. And again, I know that shocks most people, but
Mark, that's impossible, because he poisons dissidents, doesn't he?
Yeah. Actually, you can't see it right now, but there is a man with a gun pointed at the back of my head, watching me very closely for the slightest misspeak here.
So, okay, well, I'm guessing that a lot of people listening or watching are wondering how you got to where you are. I mean, just intellectually and politically. Like, how does an American guy end up with a Z badge on his lapel sitting in Moscow? And I think a lot of people will assume it's because of your wife. When you met her, that's when you, is this right?
Yeah, I mean, that's a big part of it, but it's certainly not just that. If you want my pathetic life story,
Yes.
I'm originally from bumfuck Pennsylvania, coal country Pennsylvania. My family are Slavic mutts, Russian and Slovak, and I think there's one Pole in there somewhere, and the like. But my parents don't speak any Russian. They're as American middle class as you come. But I think that I always, I'm not really I'm more third generation, I guess. But I felt that kind of second generation call to blood, I think, a little bit my whole life, where I was always interested in the Soviet Union and Russia and so forth, and Eastern Europe in general. I did come from a middle-class family. Both of my parents did not attend university and had not saved up any money for me to go to university. And not wanting to settle for something local and, not top tier, I decided to join the military.
Right.
Which, in retrospect, of course, I would never do again. We all make youthful indiscretions, but I had thoughts of a political life at that time, and I wanted to see the world, and I wanted to get money for university, to pursue a higher education at a later date. And I did not have a belief that there was anything wrong with the U.S. military and its role around the world. At that time, I had, I was 18. I had no real knowledge of the wider world and the U.S. involvement in it, and the U.S. military's role in it and everything. So I went into the Navy, and I went into the nuclear engineering program. I was a nuclear reactor operator. Spent several years in Naval Nuclear Power School, learning nuclear physics and calculus and the like, and eventually ended up on a now long scrapped the last nuclear cruiser in the U.S. Navy, the USS South Carolina. May she rot in I mean, even the people we fondly referred to her as the pig.
Wow.
On the ship, yeah. Anyway, I got out of the military after my 6 years, having participated in military actions against Serbia and the military actions against Iraq, from the comfort of the engine room of a nuclear reactor on a warship. But I began to become aware, I think, already of what the U.S. military was doing in the world and not approving of it. So I declined the very large reenlistment bonus offered to me as a nuke and walked away from the military. And I ended up as taking a job in Boston, which I as far as American cities go, I still, I guess, have a fondness for, as a semiconductor engineer in Boston. And basically because it was high paying, and I hoped to have the opportunity to go back to university there. And it was in Boston that I met my wife. She's from Crimea. She was working she's in marketing. She's marketing director now. At the time, she was working for Gillette, and they brought her to their global headquarters. And she was working there, as well as getting her MBA at Harvard. A card-carrying communist with an MBA in marketing from Harvard. Yeah. The world is full of such contradictions. So,
she's a card-carrying member of the Communist Party.
I mean, well, she's actually a volunteer as an election supervisor for the Communist Party, and they're trying constantly to get her run for municipal deputy, which I agree with. But she works as a marketing director as well. But there's lots of that there in Russia.
Now,
so we live in a capitalist world, but
Now, I know what your relationship is with her. What is your relationship with communism?
Oh, communism. Okay. So, I've gone through my political evolution through the course of my life. I've in the US, I long considered myself a Democrat. And when I first came to Russia, I actually became the chairman of US Democrats Abroad in Russia, which is, Democrats Abroad, if you're not familiar with it, it's the branches, the official branches of the Democratic Party abroad. The Republican Party is not official. So they actually vote. They actually have votes within the party. And they organize Americans abroad to stay informed of political developments and to help them vote in US elections, which is actually a really long, terrible, complicated Byzantine process for Americans abroad to do. Every state has different rules and different forms, and it's the most ridiculous process in the world compared to, say, Russia or Ukraine, where you just walk into your embassy or consulate, show your passport, and vote. I mean, which is I think a much smoother process. Anyway, so I actually worked with the U.S. Embassy here. I worked, I met Ambassador Vershbow. I worked out of the U.S. Embassy, to get people registered to vote from both parties, because we're equal opportunity about registration like that. I worked from abroad to try and help get John Kerry elected at one point, as insane as that seems now. Like I said, we all go through our political evolutions. And slowly I was starting to study in Russia as I began to study international relations formally at university, and working obviously not in nuclear engineering. That wouldn't be possible, and there actually is no secrets I could sell there for those who have fantasies. Sorry, nuclear reactors on a warship are like 1950s level technology, and we have nothing on the Russians there, and it's actually not rocket science. So I have no top secret information to sell, or never have. Anyway, so I began studying because I think many Americans living abroad have a tendency to become more critical of the U.S., in particular of U.S. foreign policy, through their understanding of the world through other people's eyes. And become very much more aware of what the U.S. is doing around the world, both overtly and covertly. Eventually, my wife, then at the company she was working for at the time, offered her another position at their global headquarters, at this company's global headquarters in London, and she said, "Can you finish your studies in international relations in London?" And I said, "I don't know, let me check." So I checked and arranged it all and got accepted. And I ended up, going there and then continuing with my postgraduate work at the London School of Economics, finishing up there. And because we were there for a few years, and, it's not the worst place in the world to live, but we didn't want to live there permanently. We always wanted to come back. And I had done my dissertation at the LSE on the Eurasianism of the Russian political philosopher Alexander Panarin, a Eurasianist, a contemporary of Alexander Dugin, and some ways a kind of a lefty rival to him, although they became much more conciliatory and cooperative towards the end of Panarin's life. He died in the 90s. And I did my dissertation on his Eurasianism as a counter to the end of history for kind of a post Cold War, framing of the world, counter to Fukuyama's end of history and to Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations, which are the other two, were the two big Western paradigms for the post Cold War world, and I think are still unrivaled in that respect today on their opposite extremes. And somehow I don't even really know how, I never really got into that. Alexander Dugin, who was teaching at the time in the sociology faculty of Moscow State University, says, wrote me up and said, it's really interesting what you wrote here. You have a lot of interesting ideas. Why don't you come to Moscow State and work with me? And I'm like, yes. I mean, I had some concerns because I had heard some things, a lot of them false, about Alexander Dugin even then. And like I said, I tended more toward Panarin's interpretation of Eurasianism, though, it was a product of its times and they did tend to coincide towards the end of their lives more. But I agreed, and I went there and I assisted him, and then shortly I was offered a lecturer position, senior lecturer and researcher there, and so I taught some and I worked with Dugin, and in many ways I helped set up an international relations program within the sociology faculty at Moscow State, bringing the texts that I had read and the way I had been taught at the LSE from a critical perspective anyway, teaching them what Westerners are taught about international relations, so that they can get that understanding there. But I also taught some classes and so forth. And then that kind of rolled into just before the conflict in Ukraine broke out with the Maidan Putsch in 2014. But I had some disagreements with Professor Dugin about his outreach. At the time, he was trying to outreach both to far left and far right. Again, right. Alexander never met or spoke before his daughter was killed to Putin. The idea that he's some type of Putin's brain or has some type of broad political influence in Russian society is no, it's just propaganda. It's complete nonsense. He has no influence in the Kremlin. Actually, they kept him at far remove, and in 2014 they got him removed from his teaching position there when he contradicted the policy they were pursuing with the Minsk Accords in Ukraine. He's a marginal figure, and he was more marginalized after that. So not Putin's brain, not even close. But I disagreed. He was outreaching to the far left and the far right because he saw the same thing that we talked about many times, a triangulated center right, center left duopoly of hegemony. Both in the United States and within most countries in Europe, where the center right, center left have have completely dominated politics. You vote for one party one time and one the other, and foreign policy doesn't change, and domestic politics only changes by fractions of percentage of policies and the like, and things continue on, and they pursue solid policies of primacy and global hegemony around the world, so that any opposition that has a chance politically of opposing that has to come from the extremes, right? What is an increasingly, left out, far left and far right that are alienated from their own, center political opposites there. So, and I perfectly agreed with the outright reach to the far left, because I could still consider myself, if not a leftist, then still a leftish statist myself. And I had no problem with that. Talking to Syriza again, this is done not at a government level, but at a Alexander Dugin, who has a marginal political movement, and academic, talking to people there. But he also reached out to far right figures, and some of them, like Marine Le Pen, her people in France, she's called far right. Her economic policies are actually to the left of American Democrats.
Yes.
She is not her father. And right. I looked at that very closely, and I said, okay, I can understand that. I could disagree with her on some things, but she mispatches the acceptable to talk to have dialogue with me. Then Jobbik in Hungary, and there it's a little grayer. There's some good people in Jobbik, and there's some scary people in Jobbik, and I'm like, okay. And then it's let's write some letters to some people in the Golden Dawn in Greece, and I'm like, what? No, I mean, and he's like, his rationale was, again, the defeat of this, but also they are supporting the far right in Ukraine and in Russia. The ultra-nationalist and racist Alexei Navalny, who is presented as some type of liberal paragon, right? Obviously, openly promoted by the U.S. as the guy they would prefer to be leader in Russia, as ridiculous as that is, with his 1% support in the country on a good day. But they're doing it to us, therefore it's fair to do it to them. And which, while a sentiment I could understand, I did not agree with, as I considered it ultimately self-defeating, and an objection to my principles. So, we had it kind of a agreement to part ways, that I could pursue many of the same political general Eurasianist ideas, better, I believed, with a degree of separation between me and Dugin. I didn't continue to meet with him or his people. I mean, but we didn't defriend each other on Facebook and the like. And so I left Moscow State University by coincidence, just a few months before he was kicked out.
Okay.
So
I asked you about communism.
Yeah.
And so Dugin is assembling at this time this coalition, you're saying, of far left, far right people. On the far right, you say that some of these far right groups he's reaching out to in Europe.
He reached out to. This was the 2013.
But right. So you call them far right, and you said some of them are scary. So what makes them far right and what makes them scary?
Okay, let me talk particularly about, because this I think is the most relevant and would prove me right. Again, I never had any, it was all from a dialogue. He's a very soft-spoken man. It wasn't acrimonious. We just agreed that I'm going to go over here, you continue doing what you're doing over there. We both have some common goals. We disagree on methodology and outreach and that sort of thing. So it wasn't anything acrimonious. He's actually someone that is he's not some fire-breathing Rasputin figure like he's predicted. He loves serious dialogue. He's very soft-spoken. He tries to find things that you have in common and reaching. I mean, it's very infuriating, because I come from an American political tradition where you identify an opposite and you want to go to town, you want to politically fight, you want some crossfire, right? And he's the exact opposite. He always looks for common interests and then examines what we disagree on and find we don't disagree so much, and it can actually be rather infuriating in its soft-spokenness at times. It's very academic, to be perfectly honest.
Yes,
very intellectual.
That's what I found.
Yes. And it's completely opposite of the way the man is presented in the Western media. Anyway, so he also tried some outreach to some traditionalist with a capital T, which would prove to be far right figures in Ukraine.
Okay.
And I met some of them at a conference in 2013. I guess the spring of 2013 outside Moscow. And I met a few of them. And I went and I came back to Dugin. And this was, the starting of my real concerns with this. And I said, these Ukrainians are fascists.
Oh.
Like they're real fascists, and you quite specifically, whatever you said in the wild moment of the 1990s when you're young, what I translated, what we, with the fourth political theory is fascism is wrong, and so forth. And I said, I think this is dangerous. And he says, it's a matter of co-opting them away from the West, which is trying to co-opt them, try to take them in as they as they supported the Banderite fascists in the 1950s, the attempted the on the ground CIA-led insurrection of the OUN, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, and the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, many of them fresh out of the SS. In Western Ukraine, at the then Soviet Union, which was the real start of the Cold War. And it's one of those things that Americans are, of course, not taught in their history books, but is not something that can be denied either, because too much documentation has been released about it. So there's a long history of that there. And I said, he says, we agree, on certain things with these people, and they're not actually pro-Western. They view the U.S. as a tool, just like the U.S. views them as a tool, right? To get what they want. They're not liberal. They're not pro-Western. It's all a matter of convenience towards seeking their goals of a Banderite fascist regime in Ukraine. And that wasn't all immediately clear to me at the time, but I did identify these people, and I said, I don't want to have anything to do with them. And that was kind of the start of my disagreements, my break. And let me tell you who some of those people are today.
Yeah.
Elena Semeniaka. She is now the international secretary and the chief ideologue of Azov.
Oh,
yeah.
Well, so I didn't know this, and I'm struck by the fact that Dugin was reaching out to the very people he hates the most these days.
Yes. That's why I said that I told him at the time that it was a mistake, and that it was potentially toxic. It always leads to blowback, no matter your rationale for doing it. They're doing it to us, co-opt them, whatever. I considered it a mistake, and I think ultimately I proved right on that accord. But
wait a minute.
Events are what they were.
This is even more intense, because these might be the people, and I think you believe this, right, who killed his daughter.
I certainly were involved in it. Yes.
Oh my God. I did not know this. I did not know that he had direct contact with these same people.
Yes. Same people. Yes. He was trying to speak to them, to find common ground with them, to co-opt them, as he saw the U.S. already reaching out, to direct them, within Ukrainian politics. And, he wanted a dialogue with them. And she is the one who is the principal ideologue behind Azov's, their policy, their ideology, which they still have today, but is never talked about in the Western mainstream media, of Reconquista, as they call it, which is the once Ukraine and Russia are taken care of, they will start the fascist revolution in all of Europe and the United States. That's their end game.
Really?
Yes,
it's
quite open. They're quite open about it. You can actually find it if you Google Azov or the Right Sector and Reconquista. She was actually with Right Sector, then she moved to Azov. You can find it. It's on there. It's something that they've talked about. They created little banners and everything. They've got little programs that they deliver on their plans for it and everything. It's a real thing.
Okay. Now I didn't know. Now, as for
another one,
Oh, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, another one that I met when we were doing a conference with some right people, trying to explain to them Eurasianism, as Dugan saw it in Copenhagen, which was kind of a comedy. This attempted dialogue was a comedy of errors, because the right in Sweden is very anti-immigrant. They're very anti any idea of multiculturalism and the like. And Eurasianism is actually a political ideology entirely devoted to multiculturalism.
Yes.
I mean, I'm geographically located to, basically Russia and the former Soviet Union minus the Baltics, but it is a celebration of the different ethnicities and cultures, even an Orientalism of them in some ways. But it's the opposite. And trying to explain that to them was interesting to say the least. But one of the people that we met there, I didn't remember him at the time, but he remembered me later, is Michael Skillet. And Michael Skillet is one of the neo-Nazi fighters who came from Sweden to fight on the Maidan and in the battalions then. And he ended up in Azov as a sniper. And he now works quietly. I assume he's still alive. I haven't followed him recently, but for the Ukrainian, the Kiev regime's Ministry of Defense. So those are some of the type of people that, when I say the toxic outreach and why I think events are what they are, and I'm not saying, oh, I was right, you're terribly wrong, but yeah, I was right. I mean,
tragically right.
Tragically, tragically.
Perhaps. Yeah, that is, wow, that is something. Okay. Can you I didn't get a chance to talk to Dugan about this when he was on the show. Can you explain his theory of Eurasianism?
Well, sure. I mean, he's got his own. Eurasianism has a long tradition. I mean, back to the 1920s in Russia, and it has its roots in the Slavophilism before that. And it's an ideology that it's kind of a meta theory. It's politics and society and culture and art and everything else that evolved among a lot of the political emigres after the Soviet Revolution in Russia, after the Bolshevik Revolution. And they came up with what they believed an ideology for Russia and the former Russian Empire, the former Mongolian Empire, for that geographic space should be, and that was Eurasianism, which is the idea that just like there's the geopolitical ideology of Europe that should be from Lisbon to the Urals, undivided and so forth, and a celebration of all the cultures there, or maybe to a more policy degree, the idea of the African Union or ASEAN. But Eurasianism is a meta ideology that that there is a common history and culture between the peoples of Eurasia, speaking again in the idea of basically the former Soviet Union minus the Baltics, with a few other gray areas of influence, that could be considered. Turkey is often referred to. There are Eurasianists in Turkey, again, a marginal political force there, but also that it should be separate from the West, that the West is not a good thing, right? And that it's not necessarily go out and seeking antagonism so much as originally, so much as a remove, and the Eurasianists at the time, they for the most part actually came to a understanding of the Soviet Union and how actually it could be a good thing, even in their minds, as creating this firewall of separation that they saw as necessary between the West and Soviet Union,
Mm-hmm.
the former Russian Empire there. So, and there have been Eurasianist thinkers ever since, every one of them taking it in different directions and having their own ideas ever since. Obviously, during the Soviet Union, it was not something that was openly banned, but it wasn't something that was much appreciated, by the Communist Party either. So, the people who talked about it and promoted it, they weren't persecuted, but they certainly weren't given any big platform for their ideas either. And there are a few of them that are pretty loony, to be perfectly honest, out there, that go into all kinds of pseudoscience and everything. It's just like if you take the liberalism, there's hundreds and hundreds of political thinkers that have taken it in all different directions, and some of them are contradictory, and not all of them do you agree with, and so forth. And Dugin is just the latest iteration of that.
Okay.
And he's taken it in his Dugin's unique ideas of Eurasianism tend to do a lot with the religious / spiritual, the connection of Eurasianism with traditionalism with a capital T, right? The idea that all faiths, particularly all monotheistic faiths, although there's debates about Hinduism and so forth, have a lot in common, and there are ultimately problematic things in modern society that have resulted from modernism. It is an anti-modernism and a selective rejection of certain ideas that were put forward in the Enlightenment. It's very academic, you could even say esoteric in some ways, but that is part of his unique. Also, right. The unique focus, particularly in later, on geopolitics. Again, his own geopolitical views have evolved, from the 90s to what they are today. But, again, very much in opposition to the West, but more in active opposition. And in that way, I would say that actually Dugin has more supporters among multipolarists
yes.
outside of Russia
That's
than
right.
he actually does followers and a political following inside Russia.
That's right.
That's the reality.
And he's been fairly prescient, because I believe is it today that Putin and Xi are meeting?
Yeah. In the at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization,
right,
meeting where India is, being officially brought in as a full member, at this time. So it's, I think, an important geopolitical movement, because, of course, now you've got Russia and China and Iran, the big three, regional or peer competitors to the U.S. and the West. But you also have countries like India and Pakistan. India, which is often considered a U.S. ally, they're playing a game there, and Pakistan, which has had an interesting relationship as well. And there are debates whether bringing both India and Pakistan into the SCO was actually a good thing for the coherency of the organization, and I have my own concerns there. But it is Eurasia, minus the European peninsula off the end of it. And it is becoming very much, particularly even more so, in the last few years, an alternative to the Western controlled economic and financial architecture of the world, which they completely weaponized against Russia. Started, it has been going on for years, and China's been a victim of it, as has Syria and Venezuela. But now, of course, more so than ever, Russia, since February of 2014, and this attempt to cut it out of all global markets, global transactions, and the like, which has ultimately completely failed. You can't isolate, because the West is not the world, and the world isn't interested in this, and they don't agree with it, and it's just the West. It's often presented as global outrage or the international community. No, it's just the West, and all of their control in the world doesn't matter, because it became a battle of capital versus commodities. And Russia has so many commodities. They're so intrinsic to globalization and the global markets as we knew it today, that, the blowback from that resulted in the spiraling energy costs and inflation and everything that the West and the rest of the world is dealing with today. But the SCO is providing kind of nascent alternative organizations. The New Development Bank as a parallel to the World Bank. Russia's and China's growing interlinked payment systems as an alternative to SWIFT. They're continually working, making steps towards the creation of a basket brick currency as an alternative to the drawing rights of the WF. So all of this is providing an alternate system, because more and more countries have seen how that system can be and now has been weaponized for control. And even countries that aren't completely aligned with Russia and China against the West are starting to see the wisdom of having parallel institutions outside their control, which is why long-term U.S. ally, the dictatorship of Saudi Arabia, is expressed interest in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and dealing with China in their own currency and the like, because they're like, this could be used against us someday. We don't like that. You're trying to dictate the price of oil to the global markets with price caps? No, we don't agree with that. So for their own self-interested reasons, they identify that they could be the victims of it. And many countries around the world are seeing the same thing. India. Yes, we have our problems with China, but no, we're not going to stop trading with Russia on your demand. In fact, we're going to increase trade with them and buy lots of oil and gas and weapons and so forth. So, it always brings to mind that lovely phrase from Star Wars: A New Hope, where Princess Leia talks about the more that you try to tighten your fist, the more star systems that will slip out of your grasp. I'm kind of dating myself there, I guess. But that's what brings to mind. The more you try to exercise these economic controls, the more you're loosening them and risking the dollar status as the global reserve currency, which supports $30 trillion plus deficits in the United States.
So now you and I and people like us are probably happy about what looks like the end of Pax Americana, of the global American empire, of the United States as the global hegemon, with the emergence of this Eurasian bloc, this alliance between principally Russia and China that's emerging, seems to me world historic. I don't see any other way around that. Which is it's already basically broken apart the
globalization as we know
it.
I call it the great decoupling.
Decoupling, right. So on the one hand, people like us think it's great that the American empire is being challenged in this way, but
there are consequences.
I was going to say, so I mean, I'm not a big fan of Chinese politics or even Russian state politics. So what do you think about this? I mean, is there anything to be concerned about with this new global power emerging?
I don't think that either Russia or first of all, obviously I have my own I largely support say the current Russian president, while reserving the right to saying I disagree with that and that, though. China's always the case of that. I don't agree with everything there. But they're governing 1.2 billion people. Who am I to criticize that? That's always the height of hubris there. I do have seen no evidence that either Russia or China has any desire for global domination. The Russian government is extremely pragmatic and overly cautious about not exerting themselves beyond a very limited geopolitical horizon, much, much smaller than the Soviet Union had.
Stop, hold on there. Let's do that first. So that is the extent of Putin's ambition. He wants to just reunite the old Russian Empire.
Oh no! I mean, no, he doesn't want to reunite the old Russian Empire, but he
that.
certainly wants to have influence as a great power within the other countries of the former Soviet Union. That space there, he wants to be free to have an allied relationship with Syria. He wanted a good working relationship with the EU. Putin himself has undergone his own evolution. I mean, he was a Westernophile in the early 2000s. He was a German romanticist. He pushed for Russia to join NATO.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he was the first leader to give his condolences to George W. Bush after 9/11 and promise Russian support for the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan. Against the Taliban, because the Taliban created problems for Russia in Central Asia, potential problems there, and the heroin trade, which only became worse after the U.S. But things are what they are. He became very much a different beast. He wanted, ultimately what he wanted was integration with Europe on partnership terms, hoping that would, provide a degree of remove from the United States. And he very much believed in working with the leaders of Europe. It wasn't so long that we had leaders ago like, Jacques Chirac and, other leaders who were of Schroeder, who were of a more pragmatic bent, that might have made some sense at the time. But increasingly, it has become that the European leaders of today are just as bent on their own ideology of exceptionalism and of Western hegemony as the neocons and their democratic counterparts in the U.S. have become. So
what does he want? I mean, what guides this guy?
Yeah, Putin is he is anti-ideology. He views ideology as restricting. He is pragmatic. He is very much a technocrat. Not dissimilar completely from the technocrats in the EU. He very much believes that the world would be better following closer to the UN principles as enshrined in the UN Charter, when it was originally created, and that a more multipolar and democratic world in the international relations sense would be better than a world dominated by US hegemony. He views Russia as a great power. Very realist perspective of international relations there, that has special national interests in the countries and its borders. But he has no desire to reform the Soviet Union. He's no communist. He doesn't believe that Russia should draw in every country of the former Soviet Union. But inevitably, he finds himself drawn into the situation where the West is still operating from this position of global primacy and hegemony. And the people who dream up U.S. foreign policy, the Blob, Rand, and the like, they're playing Risk. And when they see a gray space on the board, they view that as a space that could one day be used against them. So they have to take that space.
Right.
And Ukraine is one such space. Russia, Putin, at least, the Putin administration was perfectly fine with a neutral Ukraine, which had neutrality enshrined in its constitution in 2014, that traded with Russia, that traded with Europe, and didn't join either NATO or the Collective Security Treaty Organization. That was perfectly acceptable to him. But an anti-Russian Ukraine, where the U.S. supports and promotes political ideology of banderism in Ukraine that is distinctly anti-Russian in the cultural sense, as well as the political, and is drawn into NATO, that is a threat on multiple levels to Russia. And again, he pushed the Minsk Accords for political reconciliation to restore Ukraine to neutrality. That wasn't acceptable because, as far as the U.S. and the West are concerned, they geopolitically flipped Ukraine in 2014. Never mind the internal turmoil between people with competing national identity concepts in Ukraine, between largely the West and the East of the country that unleashed. They could stamp down the people of East Ukraine, and eventually they would, be subordinated one way or the other if it wasn't for Russia, providing them support. Putin continually finds himself put in that condition then, where even when he started this as a special military operation, read intervention for Western listeners, but that has actually very specific legal limits on the number of troops that can be involved, the resources that it can draw on, what targets it can hit and what it can't hit, and the like, because the whole premises of it is we are at war with the U.S.-backed regime that seized power in Kiev, but we are not at war with the Ukrainian people. And that has not, with the full-throated Western support, the existential war of sanctions, the flood of mismatched arms into Ukraine, that position, the increasing political extremism of the regime in Kiev, not just even before 2014, before February of this year, he is left with a position that he has to then take space. Not that he wants it, right? He wanted Donbass to be put. Crimea is a separate issue because of, first of all, the very high pro-Russian portion of the population there, but also the strategic value to Russia of a port on the Black Sea, right? That they had bases there all during Ukraine. The threat with the Maidan regime was that those rights would be removed and they would be kicked out of Sevastopol. And that was something that just geostrategically wasn't going to happen, and it coincided with a population there that is often more pro-Russian than Muscovites are. Crimea was what it was, but Donbass, with the Minsk Accords, he wanted to put back into Ukraine with a degree of autonomy, kind of a Bosnia-Herzegovina type relationship that would ensure Ukraine's neutrality and the protection of Russian language and cultural rights in East Ukraine. But he finds himself now with a independent Donbass, with the consideration of drawing that and Kherson and Zaporozhye and potentially all of East Ukraine into Russia, because now he realizes that if he doesn't take them, then the West will use them as a platform against them, like they tried to use the regime in Kiev, like the U.S. is doing with Taiwan as a giant island aircraft carrier against China. This, standard RAND policy package they call the pressure cooker, surrounding an opposing peer competitor with antagonistic countries that can be used as proxy forces, doing whatever hook and crook is necessary to bring anti-Russian, anti-Chinese political forces into power in those countries, to use them as instruments of U.S. foreign policy. They don't lie about it. They're openly open. They're completely honest about that. And, when you want to understand the thinking behind U.S. foreign policy, look to RAND.
Yeah. What was that paper they put out in 2019 was
Yeah.
called Extending Russia or something like that.
Yes. Extending Russia. Yes.
Extending
And
Russia.
you can just go down the checklist. I mean,
Right. Yeah.
so
It's remarkable how much
it's
power they
a
have.
strategy of hegemony.
Right. Okay. I want to talk about something you know a lot about, both professionally and personally, which is the Donbass.
Yes.
Because I think maybe maybe you differ with me on this, but I think that, well, so Western civilians know very, very little about what's going on because of the media here and the way they portray everything in Russia and the Ukraine. And I think the ignorance about Donbass, the history of Donbass over the last 8 years, I think that is what's most missing.
Yeah.
I think that if people in the West, ordinary people in the West, knew about what has happened in the Donbass over the last 8 years, they might have a different opinion about the war. And I think this is why they might understand why you have that Z on your lapel. Can you talk about that history just in basic terms? People, I think, know very, very little about it.
Sure. I mean, Russia occupied the Donbass and they hold the people there with guns to their heads, and they use mercenaries as pro-Russian separatists, and the government, the liberal democratic government in Kiev is, needs to send neo-Nazis there to liberate them. I mean, that's what it is, right? I mean,
Right.
and oh yeah, there might be a few pro-Russian separatists. No, I mean, all you have to do is take a look at the elections, the politics of Ukraine in the in the 90s and the 2000s up till today, to see the political and social divide between West and East Ukraine.
Right.
And it's competing national identity conceptions. And you have to remember that West Ukraine, what was called Galicia, was not actually a part of Ukraine up until the years immediately preceding World War II, right? And up until the late 30s. It was part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, or the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and briefly Poland before that. And their national identity conception of what it means to be a Ukrainian evolved through those long centuries. It is the principal component of it is certainly not liberalism. It's anti-Russianism. They hate Russia, right? And that is to the core. That is
right.
what it is. They didn't like Poles, during that period as well. They weren't crazy, about Jews at that time. But the principal component is anti-Russians. Of course, that is a problem because Ukraine, within its borders, right, as it was became independent in 92, had a population that was some 25% ethnic Russian.
Right.
And a good portion of the rest of the country, we're talking East Ukraine, often is so intermingled with, Russian families on, both sides of the borders, that it's an exercise in futility in many places to say whether someone is ethnic Russian or ethnic Ukrainian in Eastern Ukraine or Western Russia, right? They as a result of the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union, they're completely intermingled, and there's a long, very heated, fought over history of Ukraine itself, and I'm not going to go into that, but the people of Donbass they view themselves as either Russian ethnically or as possessing, seeing Russians as a brother people with some weird border that somehow got stuck between us and them, right?
Right.
They actually do have some political differences with Russia. They're very Soviet nostalgic, right? Donbass was a big factory and mining area. They have a very workers, socialist tinge to their politics and their perspective there. So there's often jokes among the shall we say the more pro-Western leaning people in the Kremlin at least up until recent years, that the people of Donbass were actually, something inconvenient. And that they didn't mesh up with, the capitalist, so it's sometimes neoliberal perspective in the finance ministry that they wanted to take the Putin administration. There's disagreement within the Putin administration. There are competing elites with different perspectives. There always has been. It's far from some type of totalitarian government or even party or administration or the like. There's lots of Putin has his best skills are actually managing elites, managing differences and different people using them towards a common. That's what he actually has excelled in, from a very pragmatic, cynical, bitter, realist perspective of the world. But yeah, the people of Donbass, they first of all, they hate the ideology of Banderism, of Stefan Bandera, of the organization of Ukrainian nationalists in the Ukrainian insurgent army, right? They fought against them, right? Because West Ukraine welcomed Hitler with open arms.
That's right.
They of course, Stefan Banderas and the others, and they dreamed of their own independent fascist Ukraine, right? And an independent Ukraine, an independent fascist Ukraine, because Stefan Bandera was a ideological fascist. And, that's what the organization of Ukrainian nationalists and its military wing, the Ukrainian insurgent army, were. And they welcomed, they formed up as, volunteer battalions, SS battalions, Nightingale, similarly in the Baltics. And, they fought against the Soviet Union. And they fought, therefore, against the people of Eastern Ukraine. Right?
Okay, yeah.
Wow. It was a little bit broader then. Just on a personal level, my wife has, I'm not sure whether it's an aunt or a great aunt, to be perfectly honest, a family member who, as a young woman, very young, was taken to Germany as a slave from the then Nazi conquered Crimea to work in the factories. She was literally slave labor. She was not taken by Germans. She was rounded up by Western Ukrainian fascists who were at many times far more brutal in their treatment of people of East Ukraine, even at that time, than the Germans troops in many ways were, right? I mean, this is when the UPA went on their ethnic rampages in Galicia against ethnic Russians, against communists, against Poles, against Jews. The SS was often at times like, whoa, chill there. That's pretty brutal and violent there, right? I mean, they were literally butchering. I mean, the photo evidence, all of this was kind of slid under Nuremberg very quietly, because even then the West knew they wanted to use these people against the Soviet Union. But some of the most brutal atrocities of World War II were committed by the Ukrainian insurgent army there. And yeah, they wanted an independent Ukraine. They wanted an independent fascist Ukraine. And Stepan Bandera, they're often said, oh yeah, he worked with the Nazis originally, but then they put him in a concentration camp. Yeah, they put him in special political conditions because he got a little bit too big for his britches. And he continued to work for them, to encourage the Ukrainian insurgent army to work with them. He met, while in his special concentration camp conditions, at a nearby castle to help facilitate the work between the West Ukrainian ultranationalists and Nazi Germany. And yes, he had brothers that were killed in the concentration camp. They weren't killed by the Germans. They were killed by Poles who were inmates in the concentration camp, who found out that these special people in special conditions were involved in the massacre of Poles.
Right.
in Galicia. That's where they were killed by. So all this rewriting of history that's going on there. And when he was let out of his, special political condition, imprisonment, as the Soviet Union began to march forward, he went back to putting on his SS uniform and fighting for Nazi Germany to the end in Berlin.
Right.
So, yes, the guy was a fascist. He was a Nazi collaborator. Yeah, he got a little too big for his britches and dreamed of a independent fascist Ukraine. But, that doesn't take away from what he was, what he did to the other people of Ukraine. And the people of Donbass, they hate this ideology. This is not the Ukraine that they want to be a part of. And you can see that reflected in the politics of Ukraine, the split between West and East, with the center, of no clear identity conception either way, and going one side or the other, depending on the prevailing economic winds and so forth. And that brings us right up until, to the Maidan. And the way the people of East Ukraine, not just the Donbass, but particularly the Donbass and Crimea, but also the rest of Eastern Ukraine saw it, the government that they overwhelmingly elected was overthrown, right? And there's this revolution of dignity. Whose dignity? Which Ukrainian people, right? What percentage of them supported the Maidan? Because actually we know this. They never will talk about this. Polls were taken, at least one of them actually commissioned by the U.S. International Republican Institute, of public opinion in Ukraine during the Maidan, about the Maidan. And these, were, respectable, polling agencies that are still used in Ukraine today. And they were reported on in the then American-owned and run pro-Maidan Kiev Post at the time. And you can find those articles out there today. A majority of Ukrainians oppose Euromaidan, right? It's not. Now, it wasn't a huge majority. It was a bare majority. It was 51, 40, 50, 53, 45, with undecided. And then another one was 48, 45. But there were consecutive polls that show the country was clearly split, and that maybe a bare majority opposed the Maidan, but obviously it wasn't all of Ukraine. The people of East Ukraine, they never supported the Maidan. If you take it the way that they have voted since, they have always voted against Maidan parties, right? They voted for the Party of Regions. And when the Party of Regions was overthrown and lustrated, they voted for the opposition bloc, right? All across East Ukraine, but particularly in the Donbass. And it was an anti-Maidan party. Today, the party, as with 14 other political parties in Ukraine, is banned, right? Because they're traitors, right? Because they don't want to be, why are we enemies with Russia? That foreign policy perspective that is both domestic and foreign policy, it's intrinsically tied with the national identity conception of East Ukrainians. They're not allowed to have that opinion. The geopolitical flipping of Ukraine cannot be revisited, which is why even before the conflict broke out, Zelensky charged and arrested both of the two main opposition political parties in Ukraine with treason. They were traitors. They were charged with treason. That's why he banned all the media of East Ukraine. He silenced them before February, right? This was a year ago that he banned all the media of East Ukraine. All the TV stations were shut down. All the print media closed, right? Because they actually showed a greater popularity. They were rising in the polls up above his own party. The servant of the people that he created with his virtual candidacy, named after his comedy TV show where he played a school teacher that accidentally became the president of Ukraine, right? The ultimate virtual created candidate.
Wow.
So they have voted against this. They voted for Zelensky because he was completely vague. He promised to end the conflict in Donbass and to fight corruption, and he was always vague on how that would be done. And then when he got into office, he went right into bed with, the ultranationalists, and he became even more of an ultranationalist and persecuting the people of East Ukraine than Poroshenko was. I mean, some of Zelensky's own comedy movies are banned in Ukraine as they were filmed because they're in the Russian language, and you're not allowed to show the Russian language. I mean, how insane is that? I think he started to internalize. He inherited a regime, right, through these, sham elections that had, these Banderite fascist battalions that were an instrumental part of the military, the security arm of the state, but also intrinsically involved with the politics, interspersed throughout the Maidan political parties. And he found that the regime depended on that it couldn't do without it, that it would collapse without it. And so I believe that, despite his Jewish ancestry, he eventually took it on board. In his comedy skits before he became president, he ridiculed, he made fun of the Banderites, of Right Sector and Azov as goose-stepping Nazis.
Oh.
And then when he became president, he was pinning medals on them as heroes of Ukraine. So, right. I mean, obviously, the man has a lot of, internal processes and contradictions, and I believe that he's probably ultimately a creature to be pitied more than anything else. But right. That's the Donbass has been opposed to this ever since. And they saw, 2014, the Odessa massacre, what has happened since. They want nothing to do with Ukraine anymore, because all of this banderism was wrapped in the colors of the blue and yellow, rather than the earlier, more identifiable orange color revolution. Mm-hmm. And so because they so co-opted the symbology of the nation of Ukraine, the idea of Ukraine has since become very toxic to them. They want nothing to do with it anymore. They would prefer to be part of Russia because for safety and, a similar culture and politics as they see it anyway, or at least more similar. But, if not that, then independence, right? They don't want to be part of Ukraine governed by this regime in Kiev as it is today. They don't want to be part of an anti-Russian Ukraine. And, there are Ukrainians on both sides of this conflict. There are tens of thousands of Ukrainians fighting alongside Russian forces, or former Ukrainians, if you want to call them that, against the regime. All the time you are reading in the Western media, very quietly and in improving tone, of hundreds of collaborators that are being arrested in every city in Ukraine, of the regime in Kiev firing its head of the intelligence services, the SBU, a lifelong friend of Zelensky, by the way, and his prosecutor general, because hundreds of collaborators, 600 collaborators, were found within the ranks of the intelligence services and the government bureaucracy, the federal prosecutor's office there. Why? That's a question that's never asked. Why are so many Ukrainians collaborators? Why are so many Ukrainians opponents of this regime? Because it's not a liberal democratic, nothing could be further from the truth, right? There are just competing national identity ideas of what Ukraine is and should be. And at this point, I think it's Humpty Dumpty who fell off the wall. I think the Maidan broke Ukraine. It was possible that it might have been put back together under the Minsk Accords. Obviously, Kiev and the West never intended to fulfill those, and it was impossible. And I don't think it's possible to put Ukraine back together again today. I think it will end with the partition or possibly the Balkanization of the country. It's only a question of on what lines, right? Is the line the Donbass? Is the line the Dnieper? Is the line, all of Ukraine but Galicia? It will never be Galicia. It will never be Lvov and Ternopil, Western Ukraine. That will, that's just toxic. If 50 years, 60 years of the Soviet Union could not debanderize Western Ukraine, then nothing will.
Right. I think that one of the things that Westerners don't know, I mean, they just don't know, is that Ukraine has been at war with the Donetsk and
its own
Luhansk
people.
Yeah, well, what those two republics in particular, the breakaway republics, right?
It's those two republics, but you have to understand that actually, the fighters, the militia, as they have often been called, now the armed forces, they're people from all over East Ukraine. They're not just from the Donbass. There are people from Kharkov. There's even members of the Donbass now from Lvov. Not many, right? A handful, right? But, from Western Ukraine. There are people from all over Ukraine who, rose up, didn't want to be part of what happened in Kiev and cared enough, to take up arms against it, and ended up in the Donbass because that's what they could hold in 2014, 2015.
Now, people in Luhansk and Donetsk, and I don't even think this has ever been challenged, say that, I mean, I think this is just a established fact, that the Ukrainian government military bombed and shelled civilian centers in Donetsk and Luhansk in response to beginning in 2014
in an attempt to subjugate them to their seizure of power in Kiev. Yes.
Now,
since
Mark,
2014,
the thing
Ukraine has been at civil war.
Right, but Mark, you need to know that I was watching BBC and PBS documentaries about this very question about the history of Donbass, and both say that the reports about Ukraine military operations against those republics have been exaggerated. It's not. It wasn't as bad as we think or you think. So, how bad was it?
Okay, I have family there. And
yes, I know. That's why I'm asking.
Since 2014, right? And they have been, I mean, just propagandistically underplayed, completely downplayed. I mean, they were brutal. It was constant shelling because they view these people. This is the way that Okay, so when the regime seized power in 2014, the military did not follow them, right? They were sent, go after these people in Donbass, right? They're terrorists. And one military unit responded. One brigade was managed to send troops there. And they were greeted by the people of, you can watch the videos on YouTube. They're still out there. They were met by the people of Donbass, right? The ordinary civilians out there greeting their tanks and APCs, with, their own bodies in front of them saying, "What are you doing? Give us your weapons. Go home." And they stopped and they were completely, "What do we do?" And they returned, and that unit was then disbanded. And it took the regime in Kiev months just to get started, but really a good year or two completely to purge the ranks of the military of anyone who didn't want a part in the new Ukraine that they were building, that saw the Donbass as something that needed to be beat down and Russia as the enemy. There were tens of thousands of defections from the Ukrainian military, police, and intelligence services to either Donbass or Crimea. Even Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty did a report on the Ukrainian Navy. It's still out there, where they admitted that 75% of the Ukrainian Navy defected to Russia because they didn't want to have anything to do with this new regime. It was not a universal consensus. It was not a, dignity of revolution of dignity for some people, not for others, right? So that's when the battalions were armed and sent in, and to begin the bloody work of trying to beat the Donbass down before they got firm control of the military there. And they couldn't, they at that time, they couldn't, engage effectively hand to hand, right? So that's when they started with the artillery shelling. And they see the people of Donbass, they call them Sovak, right? East Ukrainians, or Vatniks, right? A derogatory, essentially racist term to refer to the people of the East Ukraine who have Soviet nostalgia, who don't agree with the Maidan. It's a dehumanizing term. Another one that they love to use is Colorados, to refer to the people of East Ukraine who wear the orange and black that in the beginning symbolized the anti-Maidan political movement. And that is a dual term because the Colorados are a vermin insect in Ukraine to be exterminated, right? That's the type of terminology they have used. And there have been, the political analysts have been on Hromadske, on Kiev, which is basically Maidan. It was Maidan propaganda at the time. It was and is still funded openly by the U.S. State Department and the Dutch Embassy. They were created, set up at the beginning of the Maidan to help launch this, right? This is a U.S. State Department and Dutch funded propaganda network that ran revolution, as their 24-hour tagline on the screen, right? And they had on analysts who said that there are it's on YouTube. Watch it yourself. This is, official Kiev TV. Analysts said there are 1.5 million useless excess people in the Donbass, right, that just need to be exterminated. They say it outright, just like that. They need to be done away with, right? And so do these people want to be part of that Ukraine? Of course they don't. Right. I mean, they are the true heirs of the Banderites of the 1940s and 50s, completely. And the people of the Donbass, they've suffered for 8 years. I mean, they view the people of Crimea, the same way. They built a dam to stop the flow of water to Crimea, because stopping the collective punishment of the Crimean people for choosing wrong, that was really going to win back the hearts and minds of the Crimean people, right? No, it wasn't about winning them. It was about punishing them, because they were traitors to the new regime, to the new Ukraine that was being built. And never mind that cutting off water is a crime against humanity. It's also a war crime, in the context of war. Western media was like, yeah, they cut off water. It's good. They're pro-Russian separatists. That's the way it was treated.
Right.
Similar to the Israelis cutting off water to Palestinians.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Well, that was very illuminating. Thank you for that. I want to finish by talking about our mutual friend, Alexander Dugin. Now, I've heard you put forward a theory as to why Daria was assassinated. Because on the one hand, you're saying, and I think you're right, that both Alexander and Daria are marginal figures in Russian politics, or certainly were before she was killed. So then why on earth would the Ukrainians care, or anyone would care? Why would they go out of their way to assassinate her? But I think you have said that this is because of what the Western media has been doing.
And the Kiev regime media as well. Yes. They have inflated them through as part of their propaganda to portray, to present the Russian government in such a way, and they have caricaturized them and turned them into these bogeymen. So it's inflated in the mind, and the meme has become the reality. They present Dugin and his daughter, but to an extent his daughter as well, as the architects of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, as they depict it. And so striking a symbolic blow against him would be, symbolically. Never mind that it has no relation to reality whatsoever. They supported it. They called for it a long time ago, but so do lots of, the majority of Russians. But, they have been characterized and blown up into these bogeyman figures where striking against them would be a propaganda, a symbolic victory. And Daria herself went to Mariupol, and she reported, she did as a war correspondent. She went there and she talked to the people of Mariupol about what Azov did to them there, how they shot them trying to flee the city as traitors. They took people down into Azovstal, not all of them, some of them were family members there willingly and but others as hostages and the like. And what life was like under the rule of the openly, which all of the Western mainstream media grudgingly admitted up until February of this year, neo-Nazi Azov, in Mariupol. And they say that the way it's presented in social media is that Daria Dugin called for the genocide, the extermination of the Ukrainian people. What she actually said, and it's out there, is she talked about the people who committed the crimes in Mariupol against the people of Mariupol, and she was talking specifically about Azov there. She said that those acts were inhuman, not that Ukrainians are subhuman. She said that, again, the wonderful thing about translations, she said that they, how much it can be distorted, and Western mainstream media will never call you on it or, acknowledge it, that these acts were inhuman. And she said the people responsible for them should face war crimes tribunals, like in World War II. That is what she actually said. It became on social media, Daria Dugin calls for genocide of the Ukrainian people. You see what a really evil distortion of what she actually said. That is, and that was used. She was then viewed as a personal enemy by Azov, and how much Azov and the Ukrainian intelligence arm, the SBU, are intertwined now is practically, they are indistinguishable, right? Their members flow in and out of each other. Lots of people from Azov are brought into the SBU because they are the real ideologicals. They are, the people they know that they can be trusted, that aren't collaborators and so forth. So that's why I believe Daria was put on the Mirotvorets hit list, the official hit list of the Kiev regime, the assassination list, along with thousands of other people on there. Basically anyone who has ever said anything critical of the regime, thousands of Ukrainians, hundreds of Western journalists and celebrities and political figures, whoever has ever said anything critical. Yeah, I mean, you should probably check your own name on there.
Dugin was on there. Daria was on there. And Western American critics of the war were on there.
Roger Waters is on there. Henry Kissinger is on there. John Mearsheimer. It's ridiculous. Anyone who's ever said anything critical. And Daria Dugin's profile has since been marked liquidated across her face.
I don't know if you noticed this or saw this, but right after she was killed, many blue checks on Twitter, major prominent journalists, even a few political leaders celebrated it. Celebrated it. I mean, and these are the same people.
He deserved it.
Yeah, exactly. And these are the same people who had inflated her role and Dugin's role in Russian politics and in the war. So they made her a valuable target, and then they celebrated it.
Yes, they're the liquidation of her, which they had, I believe, an instrumental role in creating the whole situation.
Yes, I think that's right, and
that's why let's Western journalists do not view Russian journalists or any journalists from anywhere with a anti-Kiev regime perspective. Whether that's pro-Russian or just critical of it on its own regard, they regard them as the enemy. They are enemy propagandists. We are the truth, and everything they say is lies and so forth. And they celebrate the death. I mean, there were 20 journalists killed in Ukraine by Kiev regime forces between 2014 and 2015, 20 journalists and media workers. And was there any talk about 20 journalists being killed, right? Any sense of, oh, these are, professional colleagues? No, because they were all reporting from whether they were Italian or East Ukrainian or whatever, they were all reporting from a pro-Russian perspective. Therefore, they were the enemy and they deserved to die, right? So, I mean, it really is an information war, and the information war has real world effects now. It has real world consequences, and Daria Dugin, I believe, is only one of the most glaring individual examples of that.
Yes, thank you. Well, Mark, this has been very, very illuminating. I've learned a lot. Thank you for the work you've been doing. Thank you for coming on this show.
Yeah, and anyone out there who's watching, you, again, don't have to believe me. Just when I've mentioned things, I've usually mentioned sources for it, videos for it. Look and find out for yourself. Look and find out for yourself.
And watch Mark's brand new YouTube channel.
Sure. Yeah. It's just a nascent little amateur thing, but you can find some of my propaganda, some of my pro-Kremlin propaganda on it, even the ones that criticize the Kremlin, on the Real Politique with Mark Sleboda on YouTube. But you can also follow me on Twitter and Telegram.
Excellent. Thanks again, sir. Continue the fight.
Thanks for having me. You're from the belly of the beast there, so that's probably better said to you.
Oh, that's true. That's true. I'm doing my best. All right. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
This is the Unregistered Podcast, and I'm Thaddeus Russell. To become a patron of the show and have access to bonus episodes, AMAs, and the Unreported News Analysis Show, go to patreon.com/unregistered. Thanks for listening.